Now on BBC One, current affairs from Yorkshire and Lincolnshire with Inside Out.
Welcome to the programme. I'm Keely Donovan. Tonight, Inside Out's looking at one of the biggest education failures of recent times. Wakefield City Academy's trust is finally due to get liquidated by the government in the next week or so. Tonight, for the first time, the people at the very heart of the scandal speak out about what happened. "21 Yorkshire schools were left high and dry after the spectacular closure of Wakefield City Academy's trust. The government had to pay out more than £1.75 million to other trusts to take on the schools. Tonight, education reporter Jess Staufenberg lifts the lid on why the trust collapsed, leaving teachers and pupils to deal with the fallout.
A few weeks into the new academic year, and you'd never know that this outstanding school used to be called Wakefield City Academy and was at the centre of one of the biggest education scandals of recent years.
Wakefield City Academy's Trust was formed in 2013 and it took on 21 schools across Yorkshire. So how, just 4 years later, did it become the biggest academy trust failure in the country?
Many schools lost hundreds of thousands of pounds, and the collapse cost the taxpayer dearly. But it made one man and his daughter considerably richer.
There's been no consequences on them. I just hope that they never, ever have anything to do with education ever again.
Tonight we hear for the first time from people who worked at the heart of the Multi-Academy Trust about how it was run by its former chief executive, Mike Ramsey.
They were difficult times. It's clear to me that WCAT was run more like a business for profit. No moral purpose. In the 2 years that we were under WCAT, the CEO didn't come into the school.
The man who founded the trust, who saw it reduced to ruins.
I would never in a million years have thought that those sort of events would unfold.
The trustees who were kicked out after they raised questions about financial conflicts of interest involving the CEO.
I still think that it was a scandal and it's never been fully resolved in my mind.
And the finance director who claims he wasn't allowed to examine the finances.
Really I was left with two alternatives, neither of which were particularly good career moves, one of which was to whistleblow and the second was to resign.
And we ask, have any lessons really been learned, and could there be another such collapse?
Teachers and governors gather at Westminster.
This was a failure that went to the very heart of the government's flagship policy of driving schools into academy trust ownership. Many thought they were being treated like businesses, but what happens to the pupils when those businesses fail? At Waverley Academy, they know all too well. It's the day before the end of the summer term, and we've been granted access to film at this primary school near Doncaster.
Your job this morning, you've done all the hard work, you just need to start reading through with your partner, using a green pen to edit, so you might want to read through looking for spellings, using the thesaurus to up-level any words, okay?
It used to be a WCAT school, but had to find a new trust sponsor after the collapse. The head teacher agreed to speak to us.
What was your experience working as a head teacher under WCAT's regime?
They didn't have a vision and values that were clear to us all, and they didn't have a clear moral purpose for what it was they were doing. But I think the main thing for us was the finance. There were lots of difficulties around budgeting and the funding that schools were allowed. That was never clear. The biggest provision for any school is its teachers, and we would request teachers early on in the year, but those requests then were sent back with no explanation whatsoever, and that meant that we were unable to recruit quickly, so we were starting an academic year with 40% supply teachers.
The chief executive, Mike Ramsey, did he know about what was going on the ground in the school?
We did try to tell him when we were summoned to the main office at Nostell Priory, but often those things weren't seen as important or taken seriously. He was invited to come to Waverley to come and have a look around, meet the children, meet the staff. In the 2 years that we were under WCAT, the CEO didn't come into the school.
Former WCAT office manager Kirsty Whipp says she had to field regular calls from heads desperate for funds.
I used to have Diane Humphrey from Waverley quite often phone me up because she wouldn't be able to get directly through, begging me to try and get them to phone her or contact her. I have been into Waverley and saw Diane buffing her own school hall floor because she didn't have enough money to pay for a supply cleaner.
We needed to replace glass, we needed to replace doors, we needed lighting and electrics replacing, and various, archaic plumbing systems in our school, because the school's very old, 1939. But none of the work happened in those 2 years at all.
We asked to interview Mike Ramsey about the claims, but he instead issued a statement saying, "I made myself available 24/7 to those who needed support, which extended to head teachers in every school." If money was tight in WCAT schools, that certainly wasn't the case at its expensively rented headquarters at Nostell Priory.
These railings were put in by Mike Ramsey at the cost of £1,500 to keep his dogs in, and the trust paid for them.
Kirsty's come back for the first time since she resigned from WCAT in 2017. The new occupants allowed us access to film.
This used to be Mike Ramsey's office whilst he was in the trust. There'd been quite a lot on the news about schools having their funding cut, etc. But that wasn't the impression I got at WCAT. Anything that Mike wanted, Mike would get. He always had the best phone. He always had the best laptop, the best iPad. We used the most expensive equipment. And I remember thinking, what are they all talking about? This seems to be quite a lot of money in education.
Wakefield MP Mary Cray has campaigned for more transparency on the WCAT failure.
I'm absolutely horrified to hear that money that should have gone to educating some of the poorest pupils in Yorkshire should have gone to this man's dogs.
Yeah, it has a catastrophic effect on me and on my family.
Alan Yellop is the founder of WCAT and its original executive head. As the chain expanded, he became its first CEO. He's speaking publicly about the collapse for the first time.
Immense job satisfaction, probably the most satisfying period of my entire lengthy career, and huge pride in the achievements.
To start with, WCAT was lauded as a model for multi-academy chains. Alan Yellop was the darling of the Department for Education, going on to receive an OBE for his services to education.
I think we worked with schools. We didn't do to schools. We made them feel that they were joining an exclusive club.
Can you explain to us about why Mike ended up with the trust and what the thinking was around his appointment?
Mike was there at the beginning of the trust because I felt I wanted a board that wasn't a carbon copy of Wakefield City Academy. This was a trust that was serving a number of schools, and there should be a wider representation.
At this stage, Alan Yellop was introduced to a potential candidate to join the central team.
On his recommendation, we brought in Jackie Webb, and she became Chief Operations Officer.
What he didn't know was that Mike Ramsey was close friends with Jackie Webb.
I think Mike introduced Jackie to the trust while she was working somewhere else without disclosing their relationship. And also Jackie was the one that signed off Mike's expenses for his salary and his mileage.
In his statement, Mike Ramsey said there was no conflict of interest and all connected party activity was in line with policy and scrutinised internally and externally. He said the recruitment of Jackie Webb was managed by Alan Yellop. Mr Ramsey said he was not involved in the selection process, interview or decision to recruit the COO.
But Alan Yellop says that isn't true.
Rob Alsop, myself and Mike Ramsey actually interviewed her at Ilton Hall. I remember the interview.
And did Mike Ramsey introduce you to Jackie Webb?
He recommended. He said that there was an administrator that he knew at Outwood Grange.
And were you aware at that time, Alan, that he was good friends with her?
Absolutely not.
Motor mileage was 45 pence a mile, but Mike would claim 82 pence a mile. I believe at the time I was here, when Mike was interim CEO, he was being paid £145 an hour, but he was putting in maybe 16, 17 hours a day, claiming that much, that was his working hours. Obviously, they would submit an invoice to the finance, but I was then told to keep all these documents under lock and key and away from the finance team.
At one stage in 2016, records show that Mike Ramsey was simultaneously a member of the Board of Trustees, its interim CEO, and the contractor supplying the IT to the schools.
There was a problem with this acting chief executive, there was a problem with the governance, and nobody in London seems to have been aware.
In his statement, Mr Ramsey said his expenses were recorded on a time management system and submitted in line with policy and audit. He said any financial commitment for central services was approved in line with trust policy and scrutinised by the Finance and Resources Committee and the Board of Trustees while he was interim CEO.
Mike and Jackie were totally ruthless. Anybody that they saw as a threat was definitely on their way out.
The relationship between Alan Yellop and Mike Ramsey began to sour after disagreements about how the trust should be run.
I think there is a danger in the relationship between education and business. I think the principles by which they work are totally different. I think there is a ruthlessness in business. My view has been that education has certainly been good for business, but has business been good for education?
He says he took his concerns to the board, but didn't feel he had their support.
It was time to step aside. The joy had gone from the job. You know, there was an atmosphere about the place that I don't think I'm exaggerating. I'm not a person given to exaggeration, but it was at times I felt toxic.
That is one of my biggest regrets, that the guilt that I've got a daughter of the same age as a lot of the kids in there, and if I thought that my daughter's school were treating their kids the way that WCAT treated the schools and the pupils, I'd be horrified.
Alan Yellop resigned as chief executive in 2016 and Mike Ramsey became interim CEO. These two men were brought in as new trustees after several resignations from the board, but both were sacked from their posts within months. They were unpaid volunteers with backgrounds in audit and accounting. Neither has ever spoken publicly before.
So that's what we're entitled to do, surely. As independent trustees, we're allowed to challenge. And then within an hour or so, I got an email through to say that I'd been sacked.
I'm a finance director with 30 years experience. I was asked by Mazars, the Wakefield City Academy Trust auditors, to assist the Wakefield Academy Trust as a trustee to oversee their financial position. I understand the previous trustees had been removed prior to my appointment. With hindsight, I now understand that Mike Ramsey ran a computer company which supplied software to the 21 schools that were under WCAT's control. This should have been declared at every board meeting, but certainly wasn't.
In the time Mike Ramsey was involved in WCAT, his company High Tech Services received almost $900,000 from the trust in salary and payment for IT services.
Then I started to look at Mike Ramsey's background. I checked his accounts at Companies House. And it's clear that his computer company was trading insolvently, substantially insolvent. And I give an analysis of that here.
Steve and Peter were also alarmed that despite the trust running a £3 million deficit at the time, Mr Ramsey wanted a substantial pay rise.
Mike Ramsey was challenged on this, and he explained that he believed that by reducing the number of teaching staff, he could actually address the budget deficit. I felt that this was completely fantastical and that it was impossible to remove enough teachers to actually address the budget deficit and carry on as an academy. He believed that he's worth plus £200,000 per annum. And his justification for that was that he was in charge of a business that turned over £100 million. I pointed out that in a public company, turnover had to be obtained, whereas here we were given £100 million by the government, and all we had to do was control costs.
This document, obtained by Inside Out, written by Mike Ramsey, was his pitch for a pay rise to transition from interim to permanent CEO. He outlined a number of different options for his own pay, but claimed if he were paid pro rata, the same as the then current CEO, he would be on more than $369,000. He wrote, "I believe that the market rate for a standard CEO would be $185,000 without bonuses." According to year-end financial statements, 6 senior staff shared pay and benefits of more than $824,000 in 2016. The government pumped in more than £500,000 of extra funding in 2015, despite concerns about governance and finance having already been raised. Former WCAT Finance Director John Beevers is now a freelance consultant to other academy chains. He was working for the Trust when Mike Ramsey's daughter Hannah was awarded a contract worth more than £120,000. Amazingly, Mr. Beevers says he knew nothing about it.
The contract for the clerking services was one that never came to the finance team. We were aware that an advert had been placed for new clerking services, but we never saw any of the tenders, or we never saw any of the evaluations prior to the appointment of Mike's daughter. Despite requests to get that information, we were told that that was client confidentiality, that wasn't to be shared with us.
Jackie did ask me to contact some local companies and maybe bid for it, but unfortunately, because there was such a short time scale, nobody was willing to do it. There was 2 companies that attended. One was in London and wanted obviously quite a lot of money to be able to come up to Yorkshire, do the clerking, etc. And the other company was HDR Services, which I found out was Hannah Ramsey's company.
We couldn't find any record of a company called HDR Services.
After Hannah got awarded the contract, I went out with her to her first few schools and had to teach Hannah how to take down minutes and how to record them. I think the whole tender process was orchestrated to allow Hannah to get the contract.
The Department for Education told Inside Out that they were satisfied that the rules were followed when it came to the engagement of Mike Ramsey's daughter. MP Mary Cray disagrees.
The Department for Education are completely wrong when they say that the rules were followed by Mike Ramsey. It's very clear when we look at the story of the accounts that contracts were awarded without proper scrutiny. What parents want to know and what taxpayers want to know is that the money that they pay through their taxes is going into the education of their children, transforming the life chances of young people who don't get a second chance at education. And the idea that the pay packets were being inflated, that all of these people were on contracts awarded with a nod and a wink, without due process, is deeply concerning.
Mike Ramsey told us there was no conflict of interest in the award of the contract. He said it was an open tender process, which he had no involvement in.
In June 2016, a parent governor of the Hemsworth Arts and Community Academy wrote a letter to the Regional Schools Commissioner, Vicky Beer, asking questions about the contract. This 6-page letter from Peter Bell, who himself worked in Wakefield Council's clerking department, questioned the tendering process and claimed that the services provided by HDR were very poor quality and that the council could have provided them much more cheaply. He claimed Mr. Ramsey clearly has a vested interest in protecting the ineffective clerking services. He wrote, "I'm beginning to think that his involvement with WCAT is financially motivated rather than to raise standards and ensure that our children receive the best education possible." Peter Bell has told Inside Out that the Regional Schools Commissioner Vicky Beer never replied to the letter he sent more than 3 years ago.
The Department for Education confirmed that this was the case, but said the matters raised in the letter were investigated by its Education and Skills Funding Agency.
Trevor Evans was chairman of trustees for WCAT when the complaint letter was written in 2016. He says that's how he discovered Hannah Ramsey had gained the contract and who she was related to.
I knew about his daughter from a complaint about the quality of her clerking work from her own governing body. That's when I knew his daughter was involved. Other than that, I didn't know how that was set up and how it came to be.
The role of a chair of the board is to hold the chief executive to account. That's the point of them. Do you think that you did enough to hold Mike Ramsey to account?
I tried to do that. I genuinely tried to do that. I'd had, disagreements with Mike. I was always worried that he wasn't an educationalist. That wasn't his background whatsoever, and I believe there's a role there for the educator. I'm not an apologist for Mike Ramsey. Mike Ramsey is accountable for all his own actions. I had no real concerns about him that I could see openly, that things were wrong, but clearly things were not right because these other people were upset about it.
And those included Steve Corn and Peter Mackenzie, both fired as trustees by Mr Evans after they raised concerns related to Mike Ramsey. Why? Mr Evans says it was because the new trustees called a special meeting to discuss Mike Ramsey's behaviour.
We heard that some of the trustees were meeting separately and we weren't working together as a board should do. So I raised my concerns with the necessary people at Wakefield Trust.
The fact that Trevor Evans had revealed my email to the CEO, I believe, drove the CEO to organise my removal as a director because he wasn't comfortable with my independent observations.
Others have also told Inside Out that Mike Ramsey exerted undue influence on the Board of Trustees.
One of the main concerns with WCAT's financial model was that it moved the reserves out of individual schools and into its own account. One school alone lost £800,000, which it never saw again.
Following a review by the DFE, we were encouraged to centralise cash management. What we did is move all the cash into one WCAT bank account, and that's exactly what local authorities do. It's exactly what other multi-academy trusts do, and that was the way of managing cash to its maximum benefit.
But Alan Yellop had a very different idea about how those funds should be treated.
How do you feel about the fact that you didn't know, and now you know, that all that money had been moved out of those schools, £2 million worth in total, really?
Well, I feel distraught in a way because I was the person that had guaranteed verbally to all those schools that money would be sacrosanct and that the funds that were raised locally should remain with those local people.
It's unclear how much, if any, of the reserves taken from the schools was handed back when WCAT collapsed, but the government had to pay other trusts to take on the schools now without an academy sponsor. We asked the DFE how much taxpayers' money had been given to the new academy trusts to take on the 21 WCAT schools.
They told us that 19 of the 21 schools had received £1.75 million between them. They also told us they didn't know how much money, if any, was left in WCAT's accounts and would only find out when it was liquidated next week.
But we do know that the government paid £200,000 from public funds to Deloitte to wind up the trust.
It's simply extraordinary that 2 years after the trust's collapse, ministers still can't tell local people where the money has gone.
We took on too many schools, converted into academies too quickly. They were all, majority of them were failing schools, either requires improvement or special measures, which put a lot of pressure on the organisation. It was at the point in time where the government were encouraging as many schools as possible to convert to academies.
And John, you were the finance director, so is your conscience clear?
Yeah, I believe that we raised all the issues that we could as a finance team and myself personally with the external auditors, with the DFE, and really I was left with two alternatives, one of which was to whistleblow and the second was to resign, neither of which are particularly good from a career perspective.
In his statement, Mike Ramsey said,
The Trust continued to expand without the educational resources to support the high number of schools that needed rapid and sustained educational improvement.
See if you can work out how you can put a speech bubble on and get him to say something cowboy-like.
After WCAT collapsed, Waverley Academy was taken over by the Australia Trust. Diane Humphrey says she noticed the difference immediately.
The regime of Australia is all about the children, and that is what education is about.
The health and safety work to improve the fabric of the school has already been carried out, and builders were busy making sure the improved playground facilities would be ready for the new term.
The CEO, when she walked around the early years area, really saw the importance of first-class provision for young children. We're in a very low socio-economic area in this area, and providing things like play areas is really important as well. And she was as good as her word.
So many people tried to flag up to the government issues with the finance and the governance at WCAT. So the question really is, why wasn't action taken sooner? And why are some of the people who were at the top of the trust now working in other trusts?
John Beavers, the former finance director, is now advising other trusts about their budgets.
Could it happen again? Yeah, it could happen again. There's nothing to stop another personality of Mike Ramsey's nature running an organisation the way that it was run, I don't think, because there are so many. It's difficult to stop it happening until it's too late.
The Department for Education say that lessons have been learned from the failure of WCAT and other academy trusts. They say that the rules have now been tightened around accountability